Despite the skirmishes around Wellington and Wanganui and the Northern War in the 1840s, in all of which Maori had fought on both sides, the 2 decades following the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi were characterised nationally more by cooperation between Maori and Pakeha than by conflict. As James Belich has noted, a periphery of European settlements on the coast of the North Island became economically interdependent with the Maori hinterland. The 2 spheres interacted without either side being dominant, and Maori were in complete control of their own tribal territories. Most Europeans, however, regarded this state of affairs as temporary. They took it for granted that the Maori population would continue to decrease while that of European settlers increased, and that Maori land would progressively become available to Europeans for agricultural development. Maori, too, began to fear this outcome. It seemed to some chiefs that tribal culture and tikanga, customs, might be in danger of permanent extinction unless active steps were taken to preserve them. For some, a prerequisite for such preservation was a ban on further sales of Maori land. A series of meetings held in the North Island in the 1850s promoted this strategy, along with the idea that Maori should combine their mana in a Maori monarch. This movement, inspired by Te Roparaha's son, Tamihana, and his cousin, Matene Te Whiwhi, arose in part from the fact that the presence of Europeans had helped to create a sense of Maoriness. It arose too from a belief that the key to the power of Europeans lay in their unity under the British Crown. If Maori could achieve a similar unity under their own king, it was argued, they would be able to match European confidence and cohesion, retain their land, and preserve customary law and traditional authority. In other words, if significant numbers of tribes were able to coalesce, they would be less susceptible to divide and rule strategies on the part of Pakeha colonists. With this object in view, the elderly and ailing Waikato chief, Te Wherowhero, was selected first Maori King in 1856 at a representative gathering of tribes at Pukawa on the shore of Lake Taupo. He was formally installed in the position in 1858 at his capital at Ngaruawahia and took the name Potato. In the eyes of most European colonists who read about this ceremony in their newspapers, it was an act of Maori disloyalty to the British Crown, as was any expression of allegiance to a Maori monarch. In the eyes of supporters of the King movement, or Kingitanga, however, the mana of the 2 monarchs would be complementary. Wiremu Tamihana of Ngati Hauā, the kingmaker who anointed Potato, voiced this view at the Raising Up ceremony. The Maori King and the Queen of England to be joined in accord, God to be over them both. The Kingitanga came quickly to be viewed by Europeans as a blatant attempt to prevent further land sales, at a time when the populations of Auckland and New Plymouth were spilling over with new colonists. Many settlers and the governor, Thomas Gore Brown, began to voice the opinion that Maori needed a sharp lesson to teach them who ought to be in charge of the country. An apparent opportunity for such a lesson arose in 1859, when an Atiawa chief, Te Teira, offered a 243-hectare block of land at Waitara, near New Plymouth, for sale to the government. The principal chief of the area, Wiremu Kingi Te Rangitake, objected and said that Te Teira had neither the mana nor the support of Atiawa to make the sale. But Gore Brown insisted that the transaction proceed, viewing the issue as one of sovereignty. When Wiremu Kingi's supporters peacefully occupied the Waitara block in March 1860, they sparked the Taranaki War. Governor Gore Brown had called in more than 3,000 imperial troops from Australia, and they were commanded first by Colonel Charles Gold and subsequently by Major General Thomas Pratt. Maori forces, by contrast, fluctuated from a few hundred to around 1,500. They were commanded by Wiremu Kingi's general, Hapurona. The early stages of the war, from March 1860, consisted of the British storming a cordon of Maori pa that usually turned out to be empty at the time of attack. On the 27th of June, however, the imperial troops assaulted the manned pa at Puketakoere and suffered 64 casualties while being severely defeated. Maori then tightened their cordon around New Plymouth to the point where the town was under siege, and around 100 settlers died from disease and overcrowded conditions. The pressure eased only in September and October, when Taranaki Maori and some Maniapoto allies returned to their home bases to help plant crops for the coming summer. Imperial groups had a victory in November 1860 when they stormed a half-built pa at Mahoitahi. They followed this with sieges against selected pa and extending their own line by building a series of redoubts. This resulted in slow progress against Maori forces, but at enormous cost in time, lives and materials. And so Gall Brown, rather than trying to crush an uncrushable foe, opted instead for a truce in March 1861. The truce held, although fighting broke out again in May 1863 and continued sporadically for a further 9 months. By that time, however, the military focus was on Waikato and the far more extensive conflict that had been provoked there. Sir George Grey replaced Thomas Gall Brown as governor for a second term in 1861. He was determined to put down what he saw as a threat to British authority represented by the Kingitanga. He persuaded the British government not to recall to Australia the troops provided for the Taranaki War, and in 1862 he built a military route, the Great South Road, from Auckland to the northern Kingitanga boundary at the Mangatawhiri River in Waikato. At that boundary a redoubt was built with telegraph communication and strong supply lines back to Auckland. In 1863, Grey used the opportunity provided by the second outbreak of fighting in Taranaki to prize further troops from the British government. By early 1864, he had as many as 20,000 men at his disposal: Imperial troops, sailors, marines, 2 units of regular colonial troops, the Colonial Defence Force and the Forest Rangers, Auckland and Waikato militia, the latter to be rewarded with confiscated land after the fighting, some Waikato hapu loyal to the Crown, and a larger number of Maori from Te Arawa. The Kingitanga, by contrast, was able to mobilize no more than 5,000 warriors, some of them from Bay of Plenty, East Coast and Tuhoi tribes, and they never had more than 2,000 in the field at one time. The invasion of Waikato began on the 12th of July 1863 when Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron led his combined regular and volunteer troops across the Mangatawhiri River. The first engagement with Kingitanga forces came on the 17th of July at Kohiroa, where a small Maori garrison was defeated. After waiting for reinforcements, Cameron moved against the pa at Merimeri, which the defenders decided to evacuate without a fight. It was not until the 20th of November at Rangiriri that the first major battle of the war began. Rangiriri was designed by Waikato Maori to hold up the British advance down the Waikato River. At the time it was attacked, however, they had not had time to garrison it fully. The first assault left the pass surrounded on 3 sides. Further frontal attacks failed, and most of the defenders evacuated the position on the night of the 20th of November. The following morning, after confusion over raising a flag of truce, 180 rearguard defenders were captured. Cameron's forces then surged up the river and occupied the empty Kingitanga capital of Ngaruawahia on the 8th of December. The next engagement was at Rangiaowhia, the centre of Waikato's major agricultural region, on the 21st of February 1864. This action was seen as highly controversial in retrospect. The day was a Sunday, when Christian Maori would not fight, and did not expect Pakeha troops to fight either. Further, Rangiaowhia was not a fortified position, and many of the inhabitants were elderly people and children. Particular Maori offence was taken at the firing of a whare karakia, or house of prayer, in which a group of supposed non-combatants were killed, including one elder who had emerged to indicate that they were surrendering. The final action in Waikato itself was the Battle of Orako on the 31st of March to the 2nd of April 1864. This pa was neither completed nor fully garrisoned, but it withstood 3 assaults. At this point the Maori commander, Rewi Maniapoto of Ngati Maniapoto is reputed to have called out defiantly to Major William Gilbert Mayor, "E hoa, ka whawhai tonu aho kia koe ake. Friend, I shall continue to fight you forever and forever." Ōrākau was surrounded, however, and on the 2nd of April, the defenders cut their way through the British line and attempted to escape. Many were killed in the rout that followed, cut down by swords as they ran from pursuers on horseback, and many of the Maori wounded were bayoneted to death. The final engagements of the war were near Tauranga in the Bay of Plenty. On the 28th of April, Cameron, with 1,700 troops and 17 pieces of artillery, attacked Gate Pa, defended by 230 Maori. After a heavy bombardment, a storming party managed to get inside the Pa, where it was ambushed and forced to flee. Rawiri Puhirake then evacuated his forces and rightly claimed a significant victory. Cameron had his revenge less than 2 months later, however, when Puhirake and his men were caught and defeated at an unfinished pa at Te Ranga. The major engagements and dozens of skirmishes of the Waikato War had been responsible for over 1,000 Maori and 700 European deaths. Worse than this price, however, Waikato Maori were punished by the confiscation of 1.3 million hectares of land, which further crippled and embittered the vanquished tribes. This action also secured for the New Zealand government, as it was intended to do, the land with which to reward the militia troops and settle new colonists. What was taken was selected more for its fertility and strategic importance than for the owner's part in the so-called rebellion. Some tribes in northern Waikato who had remained loyal to the government lost land along with those who had not. And the group that had been perhaps most bellicose in both the Waikato and Taranaki Wars, Ngati Maniapoto, lost nothing. The government showed little interest in the precipitous hills and valleys of their rohe until it wanted to push the main trunk railway line through there in the 1880s. King Tawhiao, successor to his father, Potato, who had died in 1860, took his family and immediate entourage of followers into internal exile in the King country, thus giving that region its Pakeha name. The New Zealand Wars as a whole were far from over, however. As fighting in Waikato was winding down, a messianic movement, another syncretic religion, was gaining popularity in Taranaki. Pai Marire, known to Europeans as Ho-Ho, promised its followers deliverance from European domination. Its founder, Te Ua Haumene, identified closely with the Psalms of David in the Old Testament and wove biblical and Maori elements into rituals that included incantation and dancing around a niu pole, a gigantic version of the traditional Maori divining stick. Te Ua apparently had no intention that his movement would become warlike. Its name meant good and peaceful. But his followers, convinced that Pai Marire gave them spiritual weapons to overpower Europeans, also took up martial weapons. They attacked and defeated a patrol of mixed imperial and colonial forces at Te Ahuahu in North Taranaki on the 6th of April 1864. Just over 3 weeks later, they launched a frontal assault on a redoubt at Sentry Hill, Te Morere, and were heavily defeated. Another Pai Marire group, led by Matene Rangitoira, led a force down the Whanganui River in May 1864, only to be attacked and defeated at Motua Island by tribes of the lower river, who were credited with saving the town of Wanganui. Before imperial troops were dispersed from the Waikato War, Governor Grey decided to use the Pai Marire disturbances as an excuse to put down what he regarded as Maori rebellion in South Taranaki. He dispatched General Cameron and 3,700 men to Wanganui, and this force moved into South Taranaki in January 1865. They had the better of engagements with Maori at Nukumaru and Tengao and halted their advance at the Waingongoro River. Cameron left New Zealand soon after, and his position at the head of this, the last Imperial Forces campaign in New Zealand, was taken by Major General Trevor Chute, who led a devastating series of depredations against Maori villages in January and February 1866, laying them waste and destroying crops. A similar campaign by colonial and kupapa forces was led by Thomas MacDonnell between August and November 1866. These actions severely crippled Maori communities in the region, who were largely unaware of the purpose of the campaign, and led to starvation and long-enduring anger. Meanwhile, conflict had broken out in the Bay of Plenty and on the east coast of the North Island, sparked by the arrival of Pai Marire emissaries in those regions. Keriopa Te Rau, who had lost relatives in the action at Rangiaowhia, was involved in the killing of the missionary Karl Volkner at Opotiki in March 1865. He and his co-religionists were pursued by colonial forces and kupapa Maori. From June to October 1865, there was virtual civil war on the east coast between Pai Marire and kupapa factions of Ngati Porou. Arawa kupapa joined colonial troops from Taranaki who arrived to fight Pai Marire forces inland from Opotiki and along the east coast. Later, fighting spilled down into Hawke's Bay, where Ngati Kahungunu participated as both Pai Marire followers and kupapa. This series of engagements reached a climax in November 1865 at the Battle of Wairenga-Ahika in Poverty Bay. 400 Pai Marire supporters were taken prisoner, many of whom, with wives and children, were banished to a penal settlement on the Chatham Islands. That action spawned another campaign. One of those arrested at Wairenga-Ahika, Te Kooti Arikirangi Te Turuki, was a Rongofakata man who had fought on the government side. He was suspected of aiding the enemy, however, and banished to the Chathams without trial. After a series of visions which led him to found the Ringatu faith, another syncretic religion, Te Kooti escaped in July 1868, having commandeered a ship which took him and 300 followers back to the mainland. After his request for a pardon was turned down, he waged the most effective guerrilla campaign ever seen in the country. He killed about 30 Europeans and at least 20 Maori men, women and children in the course of raids on Poverty Bay settlements, and was chased by kupapa and colonial troops through the east coast, Urewera and central North Island for 4 years. Finally, he withdrew to sanctuary in the King country in 1872, and he was eventually pardoned by the government in 1883. The shots fired by Gilbert Mayor's Flying Arawa column at the retreating Te Kooti in February 1872 are regarded as the last engagement of the New Zealand Wars. If anyone offered a challenge to Te Kooti's designation as the country's most effective guerrilla general, however, it was Rifa Titokowaru of Ngati Ruahine in Taranaki, and his war ran in parallel with that of the Rongofakata prophet fighter. The basis for the return of fighting to Taranaki in 1868 was the government's gradual implementation of land confiscations provoked by the previous war. South Taranaki Maori resisted these encroachments non-violently and then violently. Titokowaru's forces attacked a Pātea field force of colonial troops led by Thomas MacDonnell, by now a lieutenant colonel. MacDonnell retaliated by attacking Titokowaru's home base at Te Ngutu o Te Manu in August 1868. The first 2 of his assaults were abortive, but the third, on the 7th of September, resulted in a full-scale battle and the defeat of MacDonnell's men. Among the casualties was MacDonnell's second-in-command, Major Gustavus von Tempsky, the Prussian-born adventurer, who had served with the forest rangers in the Waikato campaign and participated in Chute's Scorched Earth expedition in Taranaki in 1866. He had survived a court-martial in 1865 to become, in the minds of the Pakeha public, a dashing hero of the New Zealand Wars. His fearlessness and ability to survive near misses gave him an aura of invincibility. His death came as a shock to his military followers and to his wider audience of admirers throughout the colony. After the debacle at Te Ngutu o Te Manu, MacDonnell was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel George Whitmore, who led the Pakeha field force against Titokowaru at Moturoa near Waverley. Again, the colonial troops were soundly defeated. After this action, Belich has commented, almost the whole of South Taranaki was abandoned to Titokowaru, and the colonial army withdrew to the outskirts of Wanganui. A showdown battle was expected at Titokowaru's new base at Tauranga Ika, near Nukumaru, and MacDonnell led almost 2,000 men there early in February 1869. But the colonial troops found the pa empty. Because of some personal hara or impropriety, believed to be his liaison with another man's wife, Titokowaru's Maori support had collapsed suddenly and he retreated to the north, fighting rearguard actions en route. He took eventual refuge in inland North Taranaki, while government forces reoccupied the south. Eventually he reached a kind of modus vivendi with Pakeha settlers and started a business selling them grass seed. Just over a decade after the fighting, he was living at Te Whiti o Rongomai's and Tohu Kakahi's pa at Parihaka, where he was among the leaders arrested and imprisoned in the wake of the invasion by government troops in 1881. The latter action was sparked by non-violent Maori resistance to European occupation of confiscated land near Parihaka. This village had attracted more than 2,000 inhabitants, who were disillusioned by the outcome of the Taranaki Wars and who sought cultural and spiritual replenishment from the teachings of Te Whiti and Tohu. Both prophets encouraged further passive resistance to Pakeha settlement, such as pulling out survey pegs and removing fences on the land about to be occupied on the Waimate Plains. Despite Parihaka's pacifist ethos, many Europeans in Taranaki and elsewhere feared that the resistance campaign was a prelude to armed conflict. Native Minister John Bryce used this fear as an excuse to lead 644 troops and nearly 1,000 settler volunteers into Parihaka on the 5th of November 1881. Instead of violence, they were met by singing children, offering them food. The pa was destroyed nonetheless, and Te Whiti and Tohu and other leaders arrested, but not tried, for sedition. They then endured 2 years of enforced exile in Otago. The fate of the Parihaka community had been prefigured 2 years earlier when another prophet preaching non-violence, Te Maiharoa of Ngai Tahu, had been driven off occupied land in the upper Waitaki Valley. Te Maiharoa believed that the only land sold to the Crown in the South Island had been that in view of the coast. In 1877, he led a heke, or migration of several hundred followers, from Te Muka to Omarama to reoccupy old tribal grazing land. 2 years later, the peaceable community he had established there was dismantled and its inhabitants evicted forcibly by police. As they made their way back down the Waitaki Valley through the worst winter storms on record up to that time, several of the very old and the very young died from the effects of the freezing temperatures. What effects did the New Zealand Wars and the resistance movements that immediately followed them have on the country as a whole? Most European New Zealanders, but not all, viewed them as a decisive demonstration that sovereignty rested with the Crown, that is, with the New Zealand government of the day, and not with Maori. That, after all, was their view of what the Treaty of Waitangi had been all about. There was little understanding among Pakeha at this time that Maori might feel that the treaty had been dishonoured by the Crown in its seizure, for example, of confiscated territories, or in the many other dubious ways that governments or companies or individuals had used to acquire Maori lands or resources. The comments of Judge F.R. Chapman sentencing Ruakenana of Tuhoi to prison in 1917 for resisting arrest are instructive. They voice what most Pakeha felt about the idea of Maori resistance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You have learned that the law has a long arm and that it can reach you, however far back into the recesses of the forest you may travel, and that in every corner of the great empire to which we belong, the king's law can reach anyone who offends against him. That is the lesson your people should learn from this trial. That was also the lesson Pakeha felt Maori should take from the outcome of the New Zealand Wars. But had that outcome been so decisive? Large sections of the inland North Island were still, in the 1870s and 1880s, in effect under Maori control. Few Pakeha were prepared to risk entering the King country until King Tawhiao emerged from exile there in 1881 and formally laid down his arms and those of his followers. Fewer still felt welcome in the Urewera at that time. For Maori adversely affected by the wars and subsequent land confiscations, principally in Waikato, Taranaki and parts of the Bay of Plenty, life would be considerably more difficult physically because of the loss of economic resources which had previously allowed them to feed themselves and to trade with Pakeha and in some instances with the wider world. Footnote. Although it has to be said that the market for Maori crops in Australia had collapsed by the late 1850s as Australian primary producers caught up with local demand, just as Pakeha producers eventually did in New Zealand. So even without the effects of the New Zealand Wars, Maori farmers and horticulturists were likely to have been forced to fall back on subsistence farming. Returning to the text. These peoples also experienced the demoralization that came with what was viewed as a loss of mana. Tūhoe, too, in the Urewera had been adversely affected by the Te Kooti campaign. Their support for the Prophet and adherence to Ringatu had been punished by the scorched earth policy adopted by the colonial troops and kupapa pursuing him. In some instances, what could have been seeds of despair eventually became seeds of hope for the future. Tainui tribes, for example, continued to regard the Kingitanga as a shelter for the mana of all their peoples, and loyalty to it gave them a cohesion and a coherence that would sometimes be the envy of other tribes. And Tūhoe eventually found the same benefits from their continuing loyalty to the Hahi Ringatu. Taranaki people had tried to find grounds for renewal in the Parihaka movement, but this had been weakened by the imprisonment of its leaders, and though it enjoyed a resurgence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the movement barely survived the deaths of Te Whiti and Tohu in 1907. Kupapa Maori, most of Te Arawa, Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu, and some Whanganui tribes, mostly prospered in the wake of the wars. Their lands and resources were intact. They received favourable government attentions, including ceremonial swords for their leaders, monuments for their dead, and consultation on some matters of public policy. They were also buoyed by the fact that their mana had been enhanced rather than diminished by the wars. But all North Island Maori, kupapa, rebels, and those like Ngāpuhi who had avoided military engagements in the 1860s, were subject to the ravages of disease. And this curse, the effect of pathogens to which Maori still had insufficient immunity, took a higher toll on the Maori population in the second half of the 19th century than it had in the first. Epidemics of influenza, measles and whooping cough were reported frequently throughout this period as the rate of European immigration increased. There were also outbreaks of dysentery of massive proportions. The fertility rate declined as women suffered from general ill health and from the effects of syphilis, gonorrhea, and tuberculosis. Communities, especially those already demoralized by the effects of the wars, which had led to poor nutrition and grossly substandard accommodation in the areas subject to confiscation, visibly shrank. Nationally, the Maori population dropped from 56,049 in 1857 to 58 to 42,113 in 1896. As such figures became known, they contributed to a widespread belief among Pakeha and Maori that Maori as a people and as a culture were headed for extinction. Wellington Provincial Superintendent Dr. Isaac Featherstone echoed liberal European sentiment in the late 19th century when he spoke of the responsibility to smooth the pillow of a dying race. John Logan Campbell, who had briefly been superintendent of Auckland Province and was later the city's mayor, made arrangements in his will for an obelisk monument to Maori to stand on the summit of One Tree Hill. These were not derogatory gestures. They were expressions of respect and regret on the part of Pakeha who admired Maori.